right, guys. Today we're going to cover Standard 3.1b, which talks about how regional conflict led to the Civil War. We've already talked a little bit about this in Standard 3.1a, but there's more. So let's go ahead and jump in. Excuse me. And see what we've got. If you haven't already downloaded the notes, make sure you do so. Those are available on my website right near where you found this. So let's see what we can do. Last time we talked about how there are a number of compromises that deal with what are we going to do when we add western states to the United States. Should they be free soil territory or should they be slave territory? We talked about the Compromise of 1850, and prior to that, we talked about the Missouri Compromise. Well, in 1854, this guy over here on the left, his name is Stephen Douglas, he actually suggests that with two new states that wanted to enter the Union, Kansas and Nebraska, instead of drawing a line or coming up with some congressional answer, we just say, let's let the people decide for themselves. Let's have what we call popular sovereignty. This totally does away with the Missouri Compromise and says that any place that wants to have slavery, whether it's north of the 3630 line or not, can have it. Now, the problem is that as soon as you say anybody who we're going to let the people vote, there's got to be a vote. Well, anybody can vote in this election. And so thousands of people come into Kansas from all around the country because they want to vote for whatever they believe in. Some are going to vote for free soil. Some are going to vote for it to be slave. Now, think about who's going to come from South Carolina all the way out to Kansas. It's only going to be people who feel very, very, very strongly about what's going to happen here, but whether it's free or whether free soil or whether it's slave. So the thousands of people who come are really upset about what's been going on. They come with guns, they come with knives, they come with just really angry demeanors. And so they're going to fight. And there's a lot of fighting that happens in Kansas in 1854. We actually call it Bleeding Kansas because a number of people die, including, you see down there's a guy named John Brown. He's this guy over here in the picture. John Brown and his sons show up in Kansas, and they single-handedly pull out, well, I guess not single-handedly because it's him and his 5 sons, but they pull some pro-slavery settlers out of a cabin in the middle of the night, chop their hands off, and kill them. Well, the chopping their hands off is symbolic because the idea is we don't want those guys to vote. They might make Kansas slave. John Brown believes that God has called him to free the slaves in the South. And so he thinks that violence is one way he's going to have to do that. We're going to talk a decent amount about him in the next couple slides. Well, both sides actually claim victory in Kansas, both the pro-slavery and the free soil folks. So the president, who by this time is James Buchanan, has to make a decision. Am I going to decide that the pro-slavery forces win or the anti-slavery, not anti-slavery, the free soil folks? The northern, James Buchanan says, I'm going to go with the pro-slavery government. I think that Kansas should be a slave state. The Northern Democrats, because Buchanan was a Democrat, really don't like this. They wanted it to be a free soil state. They're upset with him, so they say, we're going to split the party. So the Northern Democrats split and join up with the old Liberty Party that we talked about in the last section. The Liberty Party is the party that was against slavery. The Northern Democrats aren't really against slavery, but they don't want it to spread for sure. That's why they're upset with Buchanan. And so they join together, the Liberty Party and the Northern Democrats, and they create what we today call the Republican Party. The Republican Party isn't going to be an abolitionist party. Okay? The Republican Party is a free soil party. They want to stop the spread of slavery. Now, there are going to be abolitionists in the Republican Party, but officially, that's not what they're all about. Okay? Well, John Brown is not done. He says, I think God wants me to free the slaves. Well, in Kansas it didn't work, so now what am I going to do? He actually gets his boys again, gets his crew together, including a former freed slave, and they go to a place called Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Now, Harper's Ferry is significant because that's where there's a federal arsenal. That's where the federal government keeps a number of weapons. His idea is we're going to take these weapons, we're going to go down into the South, give the weapons to to slaves, and let them rise up against their slave owners. John Brown and his men actually get all the way to where the guns are kept. They get to that house. And then the Marines show up. And the Marines are going to keep them in there for a little while, and then they end up busting in and arresting them. John Brown and his followers are going to be imprisoned. They go on trial. They are convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. In the meantime, though, John Brown gives a number of interviews to magazines, and he basically calls people in the North to be against slavery and to do whatever it takes to end it because it is, he believes, unjust. So John Brown dies seen really as a hero. You see the over here on the right, you've got the slave woman or the former slave holding up her son to kiss John Brown as he's led out to his execution. It's because the slaves see him as someone who's a hero. We talked about this in class. Is he a hero or is he a villain? This picture really sums it up pretty nicely. He looks a little crazy, which he probably was. He's holding the Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. He's standing on bodies, and behind him you can see the Civil War is going on. A lot of people point to John Brown and say, look, he really made the Civil War happen when it did, because without him, you might not have had as much anger and fear. You say, what do you mean anger and fear? Well, the North sees him as a hero, okay? At least many people see him as a hero because he's dying for what he believes in. He's dying to free slaves. He's a martyr. That's someone who dies for what they believe in. The South, on the other hand, doesn't look at it that way. They think he's a villain. They think he's a bad guy. They start to not trust the North. They start to be afraid of the North. Do people like John Brown speak for everybody in the North? Well, no, of course not. They really don't. But the South sees that there are people who are willing to die to try to get guns in the hands of slaves. What happens if they succeed? It's going to be bad, the South says. So the South is now more determined than ever to protect slavery. And they're going to use anything at their disposal, intimidation, violence, and the law, to protect slavery as much as they can. Now, one way this happens comes in 1857. Got a guy who is over here on the left. His name is Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave who was taken from Missouri, which is a slave territory, into Illinois, which is a free territory. He says, I'm in free territory, so I should be free. So he actually sues for his freedom. By the way, if you ever look into the history of this, there's a lot more that's actually going on here, but this will suffice for now. He gets in there and, sorry, my wife just texted me. He gets all the way to the Supreme Court, and he thinks this is an open and shut case. I was taken to a free territory. I should be free. The problem is that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is a Southerner who owns slaves. His name is Roger Taney. Roger Taney and the Supreme Court actually rule that slaves cannot sue because slaves are property. Okay, so let me put this in context. Basically what they're saying is slaves are farm equipment. Slaves are like tractors or horses. Your horse or your tractor can't sue you for its freedom, so neither can your slaves. That's racist. This is a huge deal, though, because not only does it mean that Dred Scott is still a slave, but it actually invalidates the whole Northwest Ordinance, which said we will never have slavery here in those 5 states of Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois. We'll never have slavery there. Well, now there's slavery there. This also means that the Missouri Compromise, it said no slave states above the 3630. That's not true because now any state above the 3630 probably could be a slave state. Congress can't really make any laws now that restrict the expansion of slavery. They can put slaves, not Congress, but slaves can be anywhere that the Southerners want them, that people want them. All you got to do is buy them in the South. So what does this mean? Does this mean that all states can have slavery? Does it mean that popular sovereignty is invalid and we don't get to choose, but all states are slave states? Is it possible to keep slavery from spreading? It's into this atmosphere where there's just a lot of distrust between the North and the South and a lot of uncertainty about what the state of things are, that the Republicans actually become the Northern Party. If you're in the North, you're probably going to vote Republican. And so in 1858, they nominate a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln for president. He is a free soil candidate. He's not an abolitionist, okay? He's a free soiler. He just doesn't want slavery to spread. He doesn't say let's get rid of it in the South. He says let's keep it. It just shouldn't be anywhere else. Well, today you think we have the Democrats and we have the Republicans. Well, there are Democrats, but the Democrats actually split between the North and the South. There's a Northern Democrat, there's a Southern Democrat, in addition to Abe Lincoln. So that's 3 candidates. And then there are 2 other parties that get thrown into the mix. So we have 5 candidates that are up for the presidency. Well, Lincoln is going to win overwhelmingly because even though there are 5 candidates, people are very upset about what happened in Kansas with Bleeding Kansas, and then the fact that Buchanan decided it would be a slave state, even though that was up for debate. They're upset about what's happened at Harper's Ferry, where a guy who a lot of people saw as a hero was executed for trying to free slaves, and Dred Scott, which people really don't like. So the North votes overwhelmingly for Lincoln, and he wins. Now the South, well, if you look at this map here, the South didn't vote for him at all. There is no county in the South that's orange. I know some of your key is cut off here. Mostly they voted for a guy named Breckinridge, who's a Democrat. That's the purple. Or a yellow guy who's a Constitutional Union Party. But the orange is Abraham Lincoln. And you can see that the North largely went for him or a little bit of Frederick Douglass. Not Frederick Douglass. His name is blanking out in my mind, but I can tell you later. Stephen Douglas. There you go. The North, especially large places of population, vote for Lincoln. One of the reasons that the South doesn't vote for Lincoln is that he doesn't even appear on their ballot. Like, they don't even put him on because they hate him so much. The South is afraid that it's always going to be outvoted. Always. Okay? Because there now is a free soil candidate who's only going to add more and more and more free soil states as president. Okay? So they figure they're going to lose any rights they've had. So the southern states meet in a convention and they say, yes, we agree our rights are being violated. So we're going to pass what we call an Articles of Secession, which is basically just allowing or informing the country that the South has seceded from it. Okay? The South has broken away. That's what secession or seceding means. Southerners, again, just if you're confused about why this is, they are afraid that Lincoln and the North are going to use the national government to end the spread of slavery, and eventually slavery will be abolished. That's the fear. Okay? Southerners say if that happens, you've taken away our rights. We think we have the rights to govern ourselves. That's the whole concept of states' rights and nullification. They think that if you take away the rights of states, that violates the Constitution, and so they break away. And this really goes back to what we talked about toward the beginning of the year with Hamilton and Jefferson. Remember, Hamilton always supported a strong federal government, and Jefferson always believed that the states ought to be stronger. The Federalists lined up with Hamilton and the strong federal government. The North tended to agree, tended to vote Federalist. Down to the South, you get Democratic Republicans who aligned themselves with Thomas Jefferson and a strong state government. Well, guys, that issue that we talked about in Chapter 1 is now showing itself to be a huge issue. We started way back when. There's a little rift between 2 guys and their interpretation of the Constitution. And now, all these years later, we have a civil war on our hands with the South actually saying, we think that the states ought to be more free or more powerful than the federal government, and so we're going to break away and make that happen. The Deep South does take over their territory, breaks away from the United States, forms what they call the Confederate States of America with a Confederate government, just like we had before the Constitution. And they start taking over federal forts, saying, we don't want the federal government of the United States to have control over these forts. We think we control them. And that really is what's ultimately going to lead to the first shots of the Civil War at Fort Sumter. I will throw this quote in there. I know it's not in your notes, and some of you guys might want to stop the video here, and probably you're doing it now. But a lot of people try to argue that the Civil War was not fought over slavery, but over states' rights. Clearly, from what I just told you, states' rights is an issue. That is part of the reason they break away. It's a huge part of it. But personally, I would argue that they wouldn't have broken away without the issue of slavery. This is a quote from the Vice President of the Confederacy. He says, the CSA's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon this great truth, that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, which is subordination to the superior race, means white people, is his natural and normal condition. He says, that's the foundation. That's what the whole Confederacy is based on. Guys, that's straight up racism. And I hate to tell you this, but I think that's a huge part of why the war happened. Now, that's the end of this standard. I'm almost out of time. If you have any questions, email me at ngallion@greermiddlecollege.org. Hope this is helpful for you. See you next time.